All right, today we're tackling a scenario that can seem really complicated, but is actually pretty common. What's the smartest way, tax-wise, to handle capital gains when you own and have to sell more than one home? Okay, let's dive right into our case study. So, Section 1, a principal residence problem. We're going to kick things off with a practical, real-world case study. This is a situation that a lot of property owners could find themselves in, where you have to make a really critical decision about your principal residence.
So let's meet Annalisa. She's the sole owner of a house in Ottawa and also a condo in Calgary. Life happens, right? And after a particularly tough year, she finds herself in a position where she needs to sell both properties in the same year.
And here is where the puzzle begins. For all those years that she owned both places at the same time, she can only designate one of them as her principal residence to shelter it from capital gains tax. So the big question is, how does she choose? How does she make that call to ensure she pays the absolute minimum in taxes?
To solve this puzzle, we've got to turn to the rule book, Canada's Income Tax Act. Now, I know that sounds a little intimidating, but the rules in there are actually the exact tools we need to build the perfect strategy for her.
First off, what even is a principal residence? Well, according to the Act, the key phrase you need to know is that a taxpayer must have ordinarily inhabited the property. Now, this doesn't mean you had to live there full-time 365 days a year. It just means you lived in it at some point during the year. Since Annalisa spent time in both her homes each year, they both qualify.
Okay, now here is the magic formula that calculates the exemption. It looks pretty simple, but it is incredibly powerful. A is just your total capital gain. C is the total number of years you own the property. But B is the secret sauce. It's the number of years you designate the home as your principal residence plus 1. Yeah, you heard that right. That plus 1 rule is this fantastic little bonus in the tax code that gives homeowners a ton of flexibility and real tax-saving power.
So with those rules in our back pocket, let's jump back to Annalisa's situation. The first thing we need to do is calculate the total capital gain on each property. That's before we apply any exemptions at all.
A quick look at the timeline really helps clarify things. The Ottawa home was owned for a total of 12 years. The Calgary condo for 9 years. But that period in the middle, that's the crucial part. For 9 years, from 2011 to 2019, she owned both. This is the window of time where she has to make her strategic choice.
Okay, let's crunch the raw numbers. For each property, we start with the selling price. We subtract the selling costs. We're just using a pretty standard 4% here for commissions and fees. And then we subtract the original price she paid for it. What's left is the capital gain. We're looking at just over $67,000 for the Ottawa home and a little bit more, about $73,000 for the Calgary condo. So we have these two gains we need to deal with. Now, the common instinct for a lot of people might be to say, well, that's easy, just shelter the bigger gain. But that's actually not always the most efficient way to do it. We need a better, more precise way to look at this. The best strategy really comes down to two simple steps. We've already done step 1, we've got our total gains. But the crucial part, the part that makes all the difference, is step 2. We have to find the average gain per year for each of the properties. So why is this gain per year number so important? Well, think of it as finding out which gain is more expensive from a tax perspective. It tells you which property was appreciating in value and racking up a potential tax bill at a faster rate. The smartest strategy is always to use your limited exemption years to shelter the gain that's growing the fastest. And when we actually do the math, the answer becomes crystal clear. The Ottawa home had a gain of about $5,600 per year. But the Calgary condo, it was gaining value at a rate of over $8,100 per year. So even though she owned it for a shorter period of time, its annual gain is significantly higher. And that, right there, is our answer. So the path forward is clear. We absolutely must prioritize sheltering the gain on the Calgary condo. Let's see how this all plays out when we finally apply the exemption formula. Our main objective here is to use those designation years from the overlap period to completely wipe out the tax liability on the Calgary property. Why? Because that's where each designated year is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, the greatest tax shielding benefit. Okay, let's plug it all in. For the Calgary condo, we designate 8 of the 9 overlap years. Then we use that powerful 1+ rule. So 1 + 8 gives us 9. We take that 9, divide it by the 9 years she owned the condo, and that equals 1. multiplying by the total gain, and poof, the entire $73,400 gain is completely exempt. For the Ottawa home, we use the one remaining year from the overlap, plus the 3 years she owned it alone, for a total of 4 designated years. That shelters a nice portion of its gain, too. So after applying that partial exemption to the Ottawa home, there is a capital gain left over. Now in Canada, only half of a capital gain is taxable. That leaves a final taxable capital gain of just $19,554. All things considered, that's a great result. And here's the payoff for our strategy. By focusing on the property with a higher gain per year, the taxable capital gain on the Calgary condo is reduced all the way down to 0. A big, beautiful 0. That is the optimal outcome. So what's the big lesson here? What's the fundamental principle we can pull from Annalisa's case that we can apply more broadly to our own situations? It really comes down to this simple process. First, find the total gain on each property. Then, and this is the key, determine the gain per year for each one. After that, you always prioritize your designation for the property with the highest gain per year. And of course, you leverage that 1+ rule to squeeze out the maximum benefit. If you take only one thing away today, let it be this. It is not about sheltering the biggest total gain. It's about sheltering the fastest growing gain. You target the property with the highest average annual gain first. That will consistently give you the most tax-efficient result, period. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. This whole concept, analyzing performance on a per-year basis, it's not just for tax planning, is it? So my question to you is, how might applying this way of thinking to your own assets or investments change the decisions you make?